I feel quite privileged to be able to share with you some of my fascination with underground railways, particularly that I've had since before I was a railwayman, or as some people might call it, an anorak. And as you noted, a visit to any city isn't complete until I've explored the local metro. London is one of my favourites, and I've actually spent many a happy engineering hour exploring the tunnels under London with a pair of bicycle clips around my trousers and trying my best to have confidence that the train that I can hear approaching is actually in another tunnel. And I can assure you, sound does travel really well down there. As a background for this talk, I'd just like to tell you a bit about the Underground itself. The Underground, with a capital U, is a collection of lines previously developed privately. It presently consists of what we call subsurface lines, which are the District, Circle, Metropolitan and Hammersmith and City lines, which are built by cut and cover methods, and the deep tube lines being the Northern Bakerloo, Central Piccadilly and Waterloo and City Victoria Jubilee, which are fundamentally tunnelled, although these do occasionally pop up into the open in some locations. The history of the London Underground is that it goes back to 1863, and the first deep tube was opened in 1890. Now, it would be a very boring talk if all I did was give you a list of 21 stations on the current London Underground network that have closed. So I'm not intending to do that, but I would let you know that there are 21 stations that have actually closed, 13 that have been resited or renamed, and a significant number of street level buildings that aren't in use anymore, even though a lot of them actually still exist on the surface and you can see them as you're walking around. So my talk today really is not a journey through the closed stations, because we simply don't have time. But what I do want to do is to look at a few where the engineering is particularly interesting, and sometimes where it contributed to the demise of a particular station. But I also want to give you a few interesting facts and perhaps share some interesting pictures with you. The interesting thing is about the reasons for change to the underground system. They're generally similar to those that occur today. What we need to do is we need to increase capacity, we need more trains per hour, longer trains, and the economics, such as the footfall and the staff costs. So those are the drivers behind change, which you'll see in all of the examples that I pick up, how they fit in. The picture that you can see in front of you shows Mark Lane Station, which is now known as Tower Hill, and it sits above the only section of track that truly is the Circle line, which connects between Tower Hill and Aldgate. Now, this particular station was opened in 1884, and it was renamed in Tower Hill in 1946, but was only moved to its present location in 1967. I think if you look in that photograph, you might be able to recognise some of the building around the back, but I think one of the things you'll find in common with most of the photographs that you'll see today is just how much London has changed, and that really is the reason why so many of the stations that we're going to talk about are different to what they were back then. So our journey today starts close to here, but it's actually not on the underground network. When you visit the Tower of London, you might actually notice the small building that we can see on the slide here. It came up briefly in Dave Cooper's presentation about lifts. And this actually is the entrance to the London Hydraulic Power Company, which provided the power for most of London's lift prior to the use of electricity. The building's actually on the site of the first lost underground station with a small U. Indeed, it's on at the top of the first station on the first underground line that I'd like to talk about. So although it's not part of the current network, it really does have some interesting connections. The building that you can see is the northern access to a tunnel under the Thames, the southern access being off Vine Lane, which is off Tooley Street near to London Bridge main line railway station. And the tunnel was actually dug for the first underground railway in London, somewhat later than Brunel's pedestrian tunnel that was described by Martin Knights in our last lecture. This was specifically designed to carry a 2'6" narrow gauge railway in 1869. Now, the engineer was a James Henry Greathead, who you will hear a bit more about in a minute. He was a pupil of Peter Barlow, who had provisionally patented an improvement to Brunel's tunnelling shield, which he'd failed to demonstrate was workable. Now, Greathead was a student of Barlow, but allegedly he knew nothing about this patent before developing his own. He also didn't know anything at all about the work of some certain guy called Alfred Ely Beach in the USA, who patented a similar idea. And there was a huge lively discussion in the Institution of Civil Engineers in 1895 about who actually invented it. But of course, Greathead's shield became famous and is effectively used to the present day. And there you can see outside of the Royal Exchange by Bank Underground Station a statue of Greathead. Now, the interesting thing about this tunnel is that it was actually dug in 14 weeks, right there across the Thames in 14 weeks. That's pretty spectacular. And the Tower subway was cable hauled, which used a system developed by Halliday of the Patent Cable Tramway Corporation, which powered San Francisco's cable hauled trains. So the cables were powered by two 4-horsepower stationary steam engines, one on each side of the river. The tunnel itself was 6'7" in diameter. Think about that. There's plenty of our engineers who are taller than that. And consider that in relation to the current tube, which runs in 12-foot tunnels. And the carriages on the train carried 12 passengers. It opened in 1820 and it charged a penny for second class and twopence for first class. The only difference being that if you were first class, you got in the carriage first. Now, it lasted a year before going bankrupt. The tunnel was converted into for foot passenger use after that. Remember, now it's a 7'6" diameter tunnel. And there was a toll of a penny, which lasted until Tower Bridge opened without a toll in 1894, when the whole thing basically fell to pieces. It was then passed to the London Hydraulic Company and more recently to Mercury Communications. Now, there's an interesting fact about this tunnel that although it was 6'7" in diameter, at its smallest diameter now, it's only 4 feet, which is at the tightest point. And that was because a German bomb was dropped in the river near Tower Pier in 1940. And it actually caused a completely radial compression of the tunnel, but it left it totally intact. I've never heard of that before, but it's certainly an interesting side comment to make. So if we now move on to the first station on the underground network as we now know it that closed, we can see the first line that was actually built. If you can see my pointer here, there was a line that was built called the City and South London Railway, which is the first deep tube and is now part of the Northern Line. It was originally born as the City of London and Southwark Railway, but it was extended to Elephant Castle and subsequently to Stockwell almost immediately after opening. The engineer on this line was actually none other than James Henry Greathead, as you remember from the Tower subway. And the system was to use the same cable-hauled system as the Tower subway itself. And the main reason for this was because of the lack of ventilation, which prevented steam trains being employed as they used them on the subsurface lines and through Brunel's rather larger tunnel. And if you look at this line, you can actually see some familiar layouts. You can actually see all of the subsurface lines as we now know them in their formation in 1890. And you can see here that the line which is going across the Thames through Brunel's tunnel, somewhat larger in diameter, which is the Hammersmith and City line, or Hammersmith and City Railway, and the Metropolitan District Railway. That is, of course, now part of the overground network. But what I want to do is I want to concentrate on King William Street here, which was the terminus of this particular railway. Here's a picture of King William Street with some maps. You'll certainly see a blue plaque where it used to be. And just to give you an idea, in the City of London, there's the monument, and King William Street is just here, the City and South London Railway terminus. This building here was the end of the line for the railway. There's another picture of it. And it was actually the headquarters also of the railway itself. Now, moving on, this is a very interesting station for a number of reasons. Here's a map, which I hope you can see, which came from the proceedings of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Here's King William Street Station, and here is the tunnels, which you can see go along very, very sharp and then head off under the pier. The line itself was pretty tortuous. It had a huge number of sharp turns and gradients because the line ran directly under the street, because the City of London, and CLSS Railway, City and South London Railway, was not prepared to pay landowners for the rights to go under the land. The tunnel diameter was 10'6", and it ran from the terminus, where there was a 140-foot radius curve. Railway engineers will love that. Ran down a gradient of 1 in 30 and twisted and turned in the manner that people who are on the underground often realise it's doing but don't know why. Simply because it's going under the streets. And in fact, if you look at this map, you'll see that there are 2 lines here which go into one at this point. They're actually going to one. They go one above another to go down Swan Lane, because Swan Lane is so narrow they couldn't actually fit 2 tunnels side by side next to each other. It then goes under the Thames and goes into 2 tunnels again. So you can see the arrangements that the tunnel had to follow. And there's a picture of the tunnel just going out as it's heading down the Thames. And I think you can just see how it goes very sharply, and in in a little while, it will be one tunnel above the other. Wasn't a problem because it was cable hauled, all this twisting and trying. But the problem is that the cable contractor went bankrupt during the construction of the project, halfway through it, in fact. So a decision was made to use electric traction at that time, which was totally experimental. And the track geometry used wasn't any use at all, really, for small wheel locomotives. And if we look at the platform, you'll see the nature of the locomotives. This is King William Street. They're little tiny locomotives, and they had real problems on the gradients. So operationally, what happened probably would strike dread in today's rail engineers, because the Board of Trade had imposed a really severe speed restriction on the curve going into the station. And unfortunately, at that speed, the trains couldn't climb up the gradient. So the practice became that the drivers would accelerate as fast as they could when they were going down under the Thames, in the hope they'd be travelling fast enough to make the gradient on the north side. Often they didn't, and they'd roll back into the tunnel, where they'd try again or call upon a spare locomotive to push them up. Now, interesting, the line itself was actually a success. And by 1895, 15,000 passengers were using King William Street each day. Now, due to the original construction accommodating cable haulage, it had a single track and platform which proved inadequate. So we now follow the familiar tale, additional engineering capacity. Works were completed in 1895 to install the second track and the platform that you can see there, but this restricted the trains to 3 carriages each. So a decision was made to extend the line to Moorgate, which opened in 1900, and thence on to Angel in 1901 and to Euston in 1907, which is now the Bank branch of the Northern Line. The familiar line that we know of, the Northern Line, goes up past onto Moorgate, and it meant that King William Street Station closed, and effectively the new station was created at Monument. The route also had rebored the tunnel through the Thames. This is a picture of the original tunnels which still exist. And if you go down the Northern Line platforms at London Bridge Station and look up, you'll see the hatchway that goes into those tunnels. And their tunnels are still serviceable as far as the other side of the Thames, where they're blocked off because of the Jubilee line. The third stop that I'm going to talk about is in the west of London, called Wood Lane. And it's on the Central London Railway, which is now the Central Line. The Central London Railway was built between Bank and Shepherd's Bush and opened in July 1900. And it was built in 1908 to serve the Franco-British exhibition at White City Stadium. Originally, it was a loop for trains to head back to the city to avoid drivers having to change ends. And in the middle of the loop was a depot. The drawing that you can see in front of you shows the Central Line, which comes in here, goes round a loop and goes back out again. And the station is over here, Wood Lane Station. Something that we should bear in mind at this stage is that London Underground, the Underground trains at that stage used to have carriages which had gates on them for passengers to get out. There were none of the opening doors that we see now. And here we have a map of the depot, and you can see the line coming in, going round, and coming out again out here. So the depot was fitted in the middle, and the platform that I want to look at is over here. The original locos that were used by the Central London Railway were originally this type of locomotive. They were brought in and used for 2 years only because a now familiar situation arose, which is the vibration of these trains going through London tunnels caused damage to buildings. And the Central London Railway was faced with so much costs associated with remediation works, they had to do something about it. So they were the first railway to introduce multiple unit trains in the Underground. And you can see one of the early ones here. And you can also see at the end of it, these are the gates that the gatemen would open. Now, in 1927, White City Stadium began to be used by greyhound and motorcycle racing, and they needed to carry 20,000 passengers per hour into the station. And because of that, they had to accommodate longer trains. And platform 2 at the station was the only one that could accommodate 7-car trains, and particularly once sliding door stock was introduced, where they actually needed a longer platform to get people out of the end car. Now think about this, the sliding doors were introduced at the time to do 2 things. One is to decrease the dwell time at the station, and secondly, to reduce the number of men needed on the train to open the doors. And if we go back to the map again, we can see this platform 2 here, how extending it poses a, platform 1 could be extended. Platform 2 posed a problem. Platform 1 posed a problem because to extend it pushed past the points into the depot. So in 1928, the platform itself was extended using a movable section, which I think is a fascinating solution to the problem of how you extend a platform when you haven't got the track geometry to accommodate it. The platform was 35 feet long, and it changed with the points, having a movement across, a lateral movement across of around about 4 feet. The platform was actually operated over 120 times every 24 hours, and there's no recorded evidence of any passenger incidents. Today, such mechanisms are regularly considered to mitigate stepping gap risks. They were proposed for Thameslink, where gaps at stations like Farringdon are pretty large because it's on a tight curve with trains subject to overthrow. But the risks to the timetable these days from a failed platform movement are considered to be greater than the platform gap itself, which can hardly be described as suitable for persons of reduced mobility. Interestingly, New York subway does still have such devices, but they were gaining popularity again until just recently a passenger fatality meant that they are now out of favour again. This platform itself actually stayed in use until the station closed in November 1947, when the White City station opened the next day. And just for interest, the site is now the Westfield Shopping Centre. And we can see here the map, which poses another interesting couple of facts about the Central Line at this particular point. This is where the anorak side of me comes out. Caxton curve here, this curve here, is the tightest curve on the London Underground network, which is 61 metres in radius, a very tight curve by anyone's standards. And the interesting thing is that you'll notice that the 2 tracks cross each other here and cross each other here again. And this is the only part of the railway system in the UK where we actually have what we call right-hand running. I'm not sure whether you're aware, but railway systems tend to drive on one side or the other, depending on which country they're in. And in the UK, we tend to be left-hand running. This is the one part of the London Underground network where it's right-hand running, and going into White City Station, the trains come into the platforms on the opposite sides. Interestingly, another statistic is that France itself is also left-hand running, just like the UK, so they don't have to change sides going through the Channel Tunnel. I'll now move on to another station, and now we can see a more up-to-date map of the London Underground system. And you can see on here where the route has diverted from London Bridge up through Monument, missing the bit through the Thames. But what I want to look at is what we call the Jubilee line into Charing Cross. Now, some of you might remember when the Jubilee line reopened that you could go right the way through to Charing Cross. A little bit of history here. The Fleet line was started in 1972. This was before the Jubilee line was invented. The Fleet line actually took over the Bakerloo line from Stanmore down to Baker Street. And then a new tunnel was built through Bond Street to Green Park and on to Charing Cross. And that was run until 1990. Now, in 1977, the line was actually renamed the Jubilee line. The reason it was called the Fleet line was because this bit was actually bored through the bed of the River Fleet, which probably would better be described as a sewer at that particular time. But the Jubilee line was extended to Stratford in 1990 from Green Park through to Westminster and onwards to Stratford. And at that point, the spur that went from Green Park to Charing Cross was closed. So that's the most recent underground station that has been closed, but actually it's occasionally brought back into service when the Jubilee line is perturbed. And if you look carefully, when you go into Charing Cross station, if you don't just blindly follow the flow of people and look around, you'll actually see that the entrances into the Jubilee line still exist. You'd certainly see them if you got on a train that was diverted into there, but they do actually exist like so many of the other things on the underground network. If you travel through the network and look at the platforms that you see going along, such as, for example, at King's Cross and various other places, looking through the window, you will see an awful lot of evidence of the tube stations and underground stations are actually closed. I'm just going to move on briefly now because I can see that I'm getting close to using my time in terms of innovation, because the underground has been proved to be a very fertile place for innovation. And I'd like to show you just something that was brought to my attention by Liveryman Dave Cooper, which is at Holloway Road Station. Now, there's an article in a magazine which I think sounds though it should be featured on Have I Got News For You, called Elevator World. And he wrote an article in it in 1999 which referred to this, but it's actually a spiral escalator that was installed in a spare lift shaft at Holloway Road, which was effectively two spirals going up and down, which took 45 seconds to get someone from the top to the bottom of the underground of the station, which was 30 meters. It was installed in 1906, but it was never actually used publicly because the Board of Trade couldn't be convinced that it was sufficiently safe under Edwardian health and safety standards. So it was dismantled in 1911 and it lay rusting at the bottom of the shaft until rescued and partly reassembled at the London Underground Museum Annex in Acton. But the first real escalators were, of course, installed in London in 1911 at Earl's Court. And their safety was demonstrated by someone called William Bumper Harris, and he's apparently to no relation to anyone in the RAF, who had only one leg and certified the system in less than a day by simply riding up and down it. So bringing it on to my final slide, I hope that the few examples that I've gone through will give a wider insight into our beloved London Underground system. It's shown that the problems and challenges that we find now are nothing new, but I'm minded to note that the City and South London Railway was built and was operational in 4 years, despite moving from a cable-hauled railway into an electrically powered one mid-construction. There's certain parallels with Crossrail there, where Crossrail was proposed between Paddington and Liverpool Street in 1941. Construction started in 2009, and it's hoped to be open in 2021. So that really concludes my presentation. The picture shows Aldwych Station, which was on its own branch from Holborn, formerly Strand Station, which was closed in 1994. Interestingly, this station is actually still used for filming. So when you see films of the underground on the screen, that's the likelihood is that they were filmed there. In answer to the question posed to you on the flyer, I'm sure some of you will have worked out that what the two tube stations are which have got all the vowels in them. One of them is actually Mansion House, but actually I don't really count that one because it's got some of the vowels twice. It's got two O's in it. The one I particularly like is South Ealing, which uses all the vowels only once. And my final point is to tell you that the font used by London Underground, which I've used through this presentation, is actually Johnston P22.